Hello, my name is Mihaizo Dian. I'm a researcher specialized in international relations, and I decided to do a YouTube channel dedicated to issues such as strategy, international relations, world conflicts, diplomacy, and so on. I will start with a seminar consisting of specific lectures on issues related to strategic studies. Now, strategic studies is of course the study about using force in international relations. So it's about end goals and means, as one definition will show. And I decided to speak about this because conflicts are more salient, they are more visible, they are more important in a political sense, and there is a growing interest on this topic. This is one reason, the interest. The other reason is that there is a lot of confusion and there's a lot of politics and demagogy about the subject of war and conflict. So a bit of clear thinking helps. Now, the first lecture is about what is strategy and why we're speaking about strategy and why strategy matters or maybe it doesn't matter. So this is a bit of the content. We have an introduction. We have some arguments, case studies, definitions, and several topics. Each video will be focused on a specific text. The text for today is the introductory chapter from Jeremy Black's book on strategy and global history. I chose that book because it's very accessible and it combines sound arguments with a lot of history. But it's not you don't have to learn it by heart. It's the type of history which makes a concept more approachable. So this is the context. Now, what is strategy? How do we recognize strategy? And several concepts are basically our goals. So we, at the end of this video, we have a better idea about the meanings of strategy, what is strategy culture, and what are the institutions, ownership, and context in which strategy it is used. Now, 2 years ago, I taught a seminar on strategic studies for a course, and this series of video is based on that seminar. Okay, so why does strategy matters? One way to show why strategy matters is to look at news. For example, I just looked yesterday on Associated Press and I saw two news. One is about the war between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side, and it was about Trump saying that he will intensify his bombing campaign, and the Iranian president apologizes to neighbors. So we see here there are two sides, and each side has some goals and some actions. And in our common parlance, we can say that each side has a strategy. Trump's strategy is to it's called coercion, so he uses bombardments to achieve several political goals, while the Iranian president try to find a counter to that, and one counter is to, let's say, have better relations with his neighbors. Now, Iran launched a lot of missiles against neighboring countries, including countries who didn't take part in the bombardments or countries who didn't support them. So it was an issue, and he tried to find a solution to that. Now, the other news is about Russia, who sold some oil to India. And why is that a problem? Because after the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2022, there were several packages of sanctions, and the oil was targeted. So we notice now that one conflict may be linked with another, and military powers, military means may be linked to uh, let's say economic policies like sanctions. So you see that strategy at one side is about the use of force, but it goes beyond the use of force to economy, and we'll see that there are other sides. Okay, so we will be focusing on Jeremy's Black introduction from military strategy global history. Now, for him, strategy doesn't have a fixed meaning. So strategy varies according to time, to let's say to the historical era, and to space. One way to illustrate that is to look at basically the history of the concept. In the beginning, Strategos was, let's say, a Greek commander. It was a public office, and in the 18th century, it became a domain of study. It also had the meaning of trickery. So strategy has many meanings, and right now it's understood like something like an activity, a plan, a coordination of goals and means. So, but in the future it may change. So there is no fixed meaning of strategy, and to understand strategy, we must focus on time, place, history, actors, and so on. Okay, the other idea from Jeremy Black book is that strategy is not always found in a text. So today, many countries issue a document called National Security Strategy or National Defense Strategy. Well, what Black wants to say that these documents are not actually the real strategy, and sometimes the real strategy is not a theory or a doctrine; it's common knowledge, and we will see that this meaning of strategy as common knowledge is called strategic culture. Now, the other idea is that one way to understand this, or the best way to understand strategy in our time is as an activity which connects ways, goals, and means. It's a theory, it's a concept by Leakey, and ways are concepts like say an idea about how to do things. Ends are obviously our goals, and means are various instruments. In the case of strategy studies, the means is force, but force doesn't mean conflict and wars. Force also can mean deterrence, or and force can also have other meanings too. So we have these three main arguments from Jeremy's Black book. The strategy varies meaning. The strategy is not always formalized, and the third is the strategy is an activity that connects ways, goals, and means. Okay. Now, there are a lot of examples about strategy. The most famous strategy is containment during the Cold War. It was proposed by, among others, by George Kennan, and there's like a joke that every specialist in international relations wants to be a George Kennan, meaning we all want to propose that strategy, that idea, which becomes history and will be something like chess masters. Okay, so containment meant that there was a Soviet Union, and the United States was a bit far away, had to make alliances, and including with military power, and to make some kind like a dike around the Soviet Union. So this is containment. They kept the Soviet Union in a box. The hope of Kennan and containment strategy was that in time the Soviet Union will crumble without a world war, and more or less this is what happens. So this is why containment, especially in the United States, is like the ideal type, the model of strategy, because well, once it was proposed by an intellectual who was at the same time a diplomat, and it was adopted by policymakers in a way different from the initial proposal, but still it was influential, and it worked. So containment is kind of the containment during Cold War is kind of let's say the model, and you see today in the relationship between the United States and China, the United States tries to apply somehow more modern version of containment. For example, it has close alliances with Japan, with South Korea, and it's friendlier towards Vietnam. He has better relations with India, so this is kind of a containment. So the other example is what is happening in between the United States and China. Napoleonic wars were also kind of the model of strategy, but here strategy is meant as the use of military power to gain something. In case of Napoleon, he was studied by Jomini and by von Clausewitz, who are like the master of European strategy. And his way of strategy was to use battles and win wars, which meant that he went from war to war to war until he actually lost the fight. So this is the classical meaning of a strategy, is somehow a lot influenced by Napoleonic wars. Other example is World War One. World War One is criticized today because the politicians and the military leaders didn't really have a good strategy. They haven't thought very well about what was the meaning of war, and to what goals it was subordinated. So in the beginning, the World War I started as a, let's say, short war, decisive war, and this lasted a few months. Then it turned to attritional war, and this attritional war lasted for several years. The costs were skyrocket. Then there was also revolution. Both sides were exhausted, even the sides that won the war. And at the end of the war and after the war, the question was put: why several million people had to die to achieve what? So this is actually an essential strategic question: how to link means like the war with goals, how the results, the peace. And World War II was the decision makers wanted to avoid World War I, so like the famous joke that generals are always prepared for the last war. So Germany designed the strategy of Germany. Well, some German leaders designed the strategy of Blitzkrieg, which was fast war by means of tanks and airplanes, and Blitzkrieg working, for example, in France, but it failed in the Soviet Union, against the Soviet Union. Another strategy during World War, which was famous, is a strategic bombardment, which meant you have to use big airplanes with huge payloads to target critical infrastructure behind the front lines, and targeting, for example, big factories, power plants, communication center, and so on. And by this way, you may be able to achieve a decisive victory without having to fight battles. So was the strategic bombardment, and the climax of the strategic bombardment were the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then, so these are basically the principal illustration for strategy why it matters. Strategy matters because wars are important. Wars are bloody, then they may cause great changes, and you may hope to avoid it. But to avoid the war, you must understand strategy, and it is helpful to, for example, to provide alternative policies to using force. If you want to provide alternative policy to use force, you must understand strategy. You must understand how goals relates to means and to ways. Okay, we will be using three concepts. It is better to retain them, and you can use these three concepts to understand like anything that happens today in the relations with using force. For example, uh, the Gaza repression, the war against Iran, the Russia-Ukrainian war, and so on. So we have strategy is kind of the baseline concept, and the baseline concept of strategy today, as I told you, is a combination of ends, ways, and means. And this, according to the means, it can have a more military sense, for example, using military power to gain wars or how to win a war, or it can have a wider domain, for example, business strategy. So here means are in ways means, ways, and goals kind of differ, but the notion is more or less similar. There is grand strategy. Grand strategy is sometimes called national strategy, national security strategy, and so on, or sometimes it's not formalized. It's a combination of various means. For example, you use war in combined with diplomacy and combined with economy, and it can have two focus. One is the original meaning proposed by basic leader had is to how to combine different instruments to win a war. For example, World War I and World War II were total wars, meaning the entire society was involved in the war, not just the military forces. So you have a propaganda dimension, an economic dimension, a political dimension, diplomatic dimension, and even a cultural dimension. So all these sectors were mobilized in the service of war. So this is why we speak about grand strategy, a strategy beyond the military, but still with military means. Now this was the original meaning of a grand strategy, but now today, because of nuclear weapons, grand strategy means simply a combination of instruments, because the war between nuclear powers will be suicidal. We have to think about other ways to compete than just using directly military power. So Deterrence is an example of an alternative strategy that relies on force, but it's not about using force; it's about using threats. And the third concept is about culture. Culture is a concept which has something like 100 definitions or more. Here, it is I offer let's say constructed with definitions, which is about patterns of beliefs. So shared assumptions and decision rules that impose a degree of order on individual and group conceptions. So it's a framework of beliefs. It's a form of beliefs. Okay, so now we are looking at directly at Jeremy Black's text. So it has three major parts which are important. One is he discusses the various meanings of strategy. The other is about strategic culture, and the third part is about institutions and some context history and so on. Okay, so why does strategy has different meanings? One reason is that there are different influences upon decision makers. So they are like caught in different games. So they use strategy in different ways. The other reason is that definitions depend on concepts, on context. This he means by that strategy has a cultural foundation. So there is a tradition of strategic studies of the military science based in the West, which starts in the 18th century in France and in Prussia, and is still alive today and has influence, for example, on European ideas, on American educational system, and also countries like Russia. So this is like the classical meaning of strategic studies and military science. But it's not the only one. There are philosophies and thinkers about the use of force in other civilizations, for example, in China and in India. So it's not always good if you want to have a global approach, and you want to have a global approach because the world is highly globalized today, and the war has let's say global dimensions, wars have global dimensions. So it is always good and useful to go beyond our, let's say, European traditions. Okay, there are also various types of classification on strategy, and there are also diversity of application for strategy. For example, we can have grand strategy, military strategy, political strategy, business strategy, and so. So when you try to look on a book on strategy, or to try to search strategy on Google, you have there's a lot of risk of confusion. Okay, and then Jeremy Black tries to show us the various meanings of strategy. One is about level of war, so level of conflict. Now, usually in military studies, you have this distinction for between strategy, operation, and tactics. This is not just a conceptual definition. This is also an institutional definitions. And you have, for example, military units graded according to this scale. Tactics is about how to fight a battle. Is the easiest, the basic level. Then you have operations, which are more wider activities, which are let's say bordered by time periods, by a specific region or by specific goal. And strategy is about, like, let's say, the whole war. So this is basically a classical military meaning of strategy. Then you have strategy as an idea about how to win a war. It's a more general meaning. Then you go even more general. You have how to use wars for other goals. For example, how to use war to transform your country from a medium power into a great power. Then you have this even more general meaning of national strategy. This is what the meaning that you find in national security strategies, which is about conflicts in the use of force, but it is also about other ideas. For example, about ideology, about propaganda, about economy, about corruption, and so on. There is also a critical meaning of strategy, which says that strategy is a discourse. It's politics have their way of doing things, and they invent a text called strategy to justify their practices. And there is also strategy as a general approach or practice. For example, strategy as in strategic studies is more almost like a dimension or human dimension. We need strategy overall in general. Okay, so this was about strategy. Now let's look at the strategic culture. Why we are interested in strategic culture? Because there are often situations in which we cannot really identify a strategy, but we still need to understand what goes on. So this strategic culture is a context related to the use of force. It's also a way to criticize the idea that there is somewhere a mastermind who has a very good plan to rule the world and something like that. People don't work like that. Human cognition has several limits. So one of the limits are the prejudices in which we are born, which limit our ability to think objectively. So if you want to understand, for example, the prejudice, you need to understand the strategic culture. Then the definition from Black is that it's an let's say a setting a context which combines patterns of thought like ideas, values, and the understanding of the limits of rationality. For example, you have a strategic culture that varies according to generations. Strategic culture which varies according to religion or secular societies. Strategic culture in, for example, in history. So some people speak about the strategy of the Roman Empire or of the Byzantine Empire, and there is also a strategic culture which is characteristic for an elite, which sometimes is in contrast with other types of elites or with the civil society. And there is a strategic culture for allows black to go beyond abstract thinking towards, let's say, the dimension of politics. Okay, the third part of strategic studies is about the institutional side. Now, it may sound surprising, but we don't have a stable organization dedicated to strategy, to the production of and the application of strategy. We don't have until the 19th century, and the origin is in Prussia. Up to then, they were more improvised. Uh, Even if before the, let's say, the stable organizations dedicated to strategy like staff and so on, there were other institutional contexts. For example, commander has a staff, a group of advisor, or prince has a group of advisor, and they could also sometimes be able to design effective strategies. Another idea of Beck is that the influence of strategic thinkers like Clausewitz, Jomini, and so on is exaggerated because, let's say, commanders in the field and decision makers don't always listen to them, and we have to remember they never read them, and they are important mostly when they represent the framework of the era. So basically, they are important not for their originality but for their banality. One example is a Chinese emperor who was very successful military leader, but who argued that the classical Chinese strategies like Sun Tzu were actually relevant in practice. Okay, ownership means who is responsible for a strategy, and usually are the politicians like the chief of states and also the military staffs, the diplomats, and so on. Now, we must also understand besides institutional ownership the context, the historical setting. This allows us allows us to combine cold rationality and means and so on with cultural perspective. Sometimes there is a lot of imprecision, and therefore we must look at strategy as let's say a flexible term. Okay, so the main conclusions for from this lecture are: we go we define the strategy as Leakey proposed, and ends means and the ways. This he should have been ways, okay, which means are often military power or force, but not always. Ends are goals, and ways are how to think about strategy. Strategy studies allows us to think better about strategy and to propose, let's say, better ways to achieve the goals the means available. So we cannot always influence means, and we cannot always influence ends, but we can influence, for example, the way. So this is where strategic studies can be helpful. It is closely the strategy is closely linked with the use of force, but its meaning sometimes varies. We can have a diversity of the definitions. We also must retain that the strategic culture is something more general, sometimes more useful than simple strategy. Okay. And the last thing, the important thing is we must look at the institutional setting, ownership, like the responsibles, and the historical context to understand how strategy actually work in practice. And in the end, there are several review questions. For example, what is the relationship between grand strategy and military strategy? Whether strategy is Western-centric concept, it doesn't make sense in other, let's say, times and spaces. Is it useful to speak about strategy? This is a critique. We say that discussion on strategy in practice don't matter, and they are just ways for theories to feel themselves important. Therefore, we may ask whether theory, like the ways, are important in strategic affairs, or it's just propaganda. And the last is what do we mean by strategic culture, and whether it's helpful. So that was, they have a bibliography. That was all for today. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.